when a guard would stop and talk to you, you used to stand back and you would yell so people could hear what you were saying to that guard as they walked by or within the vicinity.
But he knew what a convict was going to do before they thought of it themselves. He'd just been around that long, and he was tough.
They'd find Sparky in about every conceivable place you could imagine, which we would, of course, dump.
They'd wait until everybody was locked up, and he would open his door and run down to cell 1 and get a bugler can full of Sparky and take it back to his cells.
She had a kind of a hypnotic power. There were a great many wild cats around the penitentiary, and most people couldn't get near them. But she would stand in the doorway of the cell house and say, "Kitty, kitty, kitty," and those cats would go to her.
Welcome back, folks, to another episode of Behind Gray Walls, a podcast about the men and women who lived, worked, and served time here in the old Idaho Penitentiary. I'm over in the trenches at the penitentiary on the phone right now with Skye. Skye, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm so good. By the way, that's Samuel. He didn't introduce himself.
I'm still getting used to starting this. I'm Samuel. I have my great co-host today, Skye, talking to me over in Texas. Anthony, busy as always, is going to try to join us in progress, so keep your fingers crossed, and we might have that special host join us partway through. This is going to be a very special Stool Pigeon Saturday. We have a fantastic guest here today, and I think you'll be very excited to hear from her. Today on the show, we have Jan Cerney. Jan Cerney, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing pretty good. I'm ready to give you some information on Calamity and Elijah.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, Jan. It's my pleasure to introduce our listeners to Jan Cerney. Jan started a career as an author after retiring from teaching. During this time, she's published both fiction and nonfiction books in addition to her 10 fiction novels. She has authored 11 different historical books for Arcadia, 2 self-published history books, 5 historical essays, and her Memoirs of a Country Girl. Many of her nonfiction books have revolved around the histories of South Dakota and Western expansion. Jan has presented at historical conferences, appeared in documentaries, been interviewed for television, and has received the award of Professional Historian at the West River History Conference. Out of all 22 books, we invited Jan to the show today to talk about one in particular, and that is her incredible work, Calamity Jane and her siblings, the saga of Lena and Elijah Cerney. Jan, of course, welcome to the show. How has your summer been so far?
Well, it's been hot and dry.
Where are you located?
South Dakota, in the western part of South Dakota.
And so what is summer normally like? Is it also normally hot and dry, or is this very unusual for South Dakota?
Well, it's really, really dry this year. Usually we're semi-arid, but this is extremely dry. We just haven't been getting any rain. And the heat, is high 90s or the triple digits. So it's been, challenging.
We've had a tough summer here in Boise because all of the forests around us are on fire. The sawtooths are on fire, Oregon's on fire, and so we have had just weeks of this weird murky haze in which we aren't really able to see the sky.
Yeah, it's drifted into South Dakota, too, and it's just been horrible for a lot of people.
Yeah, hopefully we have some rain coming soon. We'll keep our fingers crossed.
Definitely.
Well, I think that is kind of a great little segue. Just to first, Jan, would you sort of introduce yourself to our audience? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, I was born in Gregory, South Dakota, and I lived on a farm with my parents and one sister who came along 10 years later after me. I attended schools in Gregory County, and then I went on to attend Black Hills State College in Spearfish in beautiful Black Hills of South Dakota. I majored in history with minors in library science and English. I married in 1971. I went back later and earned my reading specialist endorsement. After graduation, I was either employed as a high school librarian or a title teacher in the states of Nebraska, California, and South Dakota. And after moving back to South Dakota from California, we purchased a ranch. So I taught, 21 years or so. And then I retired to concentrating on raising our family of 3 children. And then when the children enrolled in school, I taught Head Start for 3 years and taught part-time at Ogallala Lakota College, as well as working in a gift shop at the Prairie Homestead on the edge of the South Dakota Badlands. The Badlands aren't far from where our ranch is. So I'm now retired and doing my best to keep up with the ranch as well as 6 grandchildren and their events. Our ranch is located between Kadoka and Wall, South Dakota.
What a cool place to study history. It's really studying history where so much history took place.
Yes. I think that was one of the reasons I started writing, the atmosphere of where we live and everything just kind of pushed me towards it.
I heard recently someone make the comment, it's hard to write histories of locations you haven't been, just because it's hard to try and envision what that weather would have been like, what the bugs would be like. And obviously it's changed a little bit since this era, especially in some of the more remote areas. I'm sure there's a bit of that area that looks the way it did 100, 200 years ago.
Yeah, it does pretty much where we're at, we have the prairies and then when we're in a drought cycle, I mean, you can visualize what it was like for those people living in dugouts or sod houses, with no air conditioning and whatever, how they made it, They didn't have irrigation or running water or, it's hard to imagine.
What motivated you to start writing books and start publishing?
Well, when I was in college majoring in history, we had to do a lot of papers. And I learned to do research, although we didn't have the internet at that time, which makes it so much easier. But I would get good grades on my papers, and I enjoyed research, and I enjoyed writing. So over time, I felt this compulsion to write. For some reason, it was a strange thing. Well, I was too busy. I had a family to raise, and we were on the ranch and whatever, and it was busy. But when I was 50, I think it was, I enrolled in a writing workshop so I could hone my skills. And then I began to write family histories. I started with those. And then when I felt more confident, I submitted an application to Arcadia Publishing to write a book on the Badlands for their Images of America series, and I was accepted. And then afterwards, I went on to write 8 more books for them. And then I self-published some books on history because it's hard to get published. And so I did one on Wild Bill Hickok, and I did one on the Fort Pierre Deadwood Gold Trail. I self-published those and sold those. And I'm not writing much. I'm not writing now. I wrote papers for the West River History Conference, which was held in the Black Hills in various locations. But right now, I guess I am writing another family history. Let's put it that way.
Being from that area, I'm sure the tales of Calamity Jane and, as you say, Wild Bill Hickok are, all over. So what first really made you interested in telling the story of Calamity Jane and adding this new twist of adding her family to the story?
Well, I've been interested in Calamity Jane when I was about 12, I think it was. Someone gave me a book on the history of the Black Hills. And in that book, it was written by Corsi, I believe. In that book was a chapter on Calamity. And I just really thought her story was just wonderful. And of course, there was a picture of her in her buckskins and whatever. She was really unusual, for the time period that I lived in. Was really interested in her, and I just thought someday I'm going to learn more. Well, several years later, I had the opportunity to go to Deadwood. Went to some kind of conference up there when I was just a teenager, I believe. So I went to the gravesite. She's buried in Deadwood, and so is Wild Bill Hickok, and they're buried side by side. And so I was just enamored with the whole setup. So I never really forgot her. I was at a book signing of mine, and I visited with a lady who was a descendant of not Calamity Jane, but of her sister. And she was telling me Calamity Jane, had a sister and a brother. Well, I didn't know that. And so immediately after talking to her, I went home and I started researching. And my gosh, I found out all about Elijah and Lena, and I didn't stop. I had to write a book about them.
The mark of a true historian.
Well, and we're glad you did. I think that can often be an overlooked part of people's lives. Family obviously plays such a vital role in how you develop things you manage to get yourself into as an adult, both the good and the bad. And so I think it's hard to talk about anyone without talking about their family. It's kind of interesting because that's a story, especially with Calamity, that never really was talked about before you published this book.
Right. And, what happened with her family, it affected her life. I mean, we can't make excuses for some of the things she did because she had a bad start, in the world.
Yeah.
But it does help understand maybe some of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As you were researching this, as you were going through the historical documents, the old newspapers, one at a time, what surprised you the most about this story and about Calamity's family?
Well, I think what surprised me was that first she even had it. Well, of course she would have a family, but I didn't know anything about it. So they were orphaned at a young age, she and her siblings, and there's some controversy about her siblings, how many there were and who they were. So that's kind of muddled. Her whole life is muddled, actually. But that's probably what surprised me, and then how they made it in the world, orphaned at such a young age. I thought everything was just fascinating when I got into it. And the fact that the newspapers, when she became more of a legend and whatever, and she was quite a unique character, the newspapers, wrote about her. I just couldn't get enough reading.
It's a fascinating story. There's a lot of unknowns and question marks and stories that you're like wondering what's happening, what's being said behind closed doors, especially like with Calamity visiting her sister in particular. The brother-in-law started discouraging those visits. It makes you wonder what those family reunions would have looked like after that point.
Lena's husband really didn't want Calamity around, and she had to stay at the Borner schoolhouse when she visited Lena, and then she waited till John Borner left to go somewhere, and then she'd go visit her sister, because he thought that she was a bad influence, because Lena was completely different. She was a wife and mother, and she didn't do any of this outrageous stuff that Calamity did.
Yeah. She wasn't the sibling who was raising hell.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, for those listeners who haven't yet had a chance to read your book, could you give us just like a little, quick overview of her two siblings, just to kind of tease and get people interested in learning more about her siblings?
Okay, well, when they left, the family left Princeton, Missouri, to go west in about 1865. And Calamity was maybe, this isn't set in stone because no one really kept track of ages and all this, 8 or 9 years old at the time. And there was a sibling called Silas. He was 7. Something happened to him, and we're not sure what. Lena was 5, and Elijah was probably 2 when they left their home in Missouri. When the parents died, they died in 1866. We have the mother dying in Blackfoot, Montana in 1866. He died, Robert was his name, the father died in 1867. So the children were orphans. And so Calamity, which is hard to believe at her age, if she was 9, that she would find homes for her brother and sister, or maybe sisters, I'm not sure, in Salt Lake City. So she left, she found homes somehow, Mormon community, and I believe the Canaries must have been some Mormon persuasion. I'm not sure, but I think so. And she found homes, but then she went out on her own, and she lived with some woman that wasn't identified, but evidently she must not have treated her very well in Salt Lake, so she ran away to an army post by the name of Fort Bridger. And while she was there, Martha, Calamity's name was Martha. Well, she was there. The Gallaghers, a family of the Gallaghers, picked her up and took her, kind of adopted her. But she was kind of a hellion, even at that age, and they couldn't control her. And so the miners raised money to send her to the railroad. So she made a name for herself, it says, along the line of the Union Pacific. So she just went from town to town, and I don't know what she was doing. Some of those years are lost. She left them there for a while. Both Elijah was called Lige. She left them there, and then she went back to get them later. Calamity did. She met in South Pass City. Somehow she got to South Pass City in Wyoming, and she met this John Borner. And he was making trips with his wagon to Salt Lake City for supplies back and forth, for this mining camp there. And it was also a pass. He got into an accident and broke his leg, and she helped. She was really good at nursing. I don't know how she learned that, but she did. So she got him fixed up, but he couldn't drive his wagon. So she made a trip to Salt Lake City with a load and bring a load back, and she picked her siblings, Lige, because she knew where they were, Lige and Lena, and brought them back. And then later, Lena would marry, she was quite young though, but she would marry this John Borner. John Borner even took Lige for a while, but Lige didn't stay. We don't know how long. He stayed with Borners, and then he left on his own, and that's where he got into trouble with horse stealing and whatever. The first escapade, he had this idea along with some other guys to herd these horses onto the railroad track. And I don't know if they staked them. I don't think they did. I'm not sure how they did it. But anyway, the train would come through and would run into the horses and kill them, and which is really gruesome. But and then they would say, "Oh, you killed our horses. You owe us money," and whatever. And that worked for a while. And then they got wise to it. And then he was incarcerated for that, and he was given 5 years. But they let him out earlier. It was more like 4 years. In the meantime, he had married this woman, Kate Carson, and she was related to Kit Carson. So she had, a frontier background, and they had a child born to them while he was in prison, and they named him Frank. Later, she divorced him because she didn't know that he was an outlaw.
Oh, wow.
They tried to get him out early, but they let him out for good behavior. And then, of course, he didn't learn his lesson.
Is it a similar scheme, or is it a little bit different? Or is it a different crime altogether when he's in the Idaho one?
Horse stealing, I think. He got caught again where he was living, in that area of Idaho, the border of Idaho and Wyoming. Was a good place for outlaws because they could hide, and they had hideouts in there, and so he somehow got hooked up with those people. Even the cousins say that possibly he could have run with Butch Cassidy, who was a famous outlaw at that time and operated in that area. But I don't know. There isn't any proof other than the cousin said that.
And this is the same time that Teton Jackson and Trafton are also running horse smuggling operations in these areas. So it's possible Lige knew them or worked with them or competed against them. This was kind of a low population time for eastern Idaho. And so it's likely these individuals knew of each other at very least.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, there isn't any direct proof, but I would think so. I think they were all operating in the same area. And it really got bad. The newspaper would print a story about it, about outlaws and what they were doing. Although Butch Cassidy, they also robbed banks. Well, Elijah, as far as I know, didn't. Yeah. He was just into the horse trade.
During this season of the podcast, we talk about Trafton, who was a horse thief and worked for Teton Jackson, and his home base was in Victor, Idaho, which of course is very beloved to my heart, as listeners of the show would know. And it's actually where Lige was caught for stealing horses. Did you go into any of the locations that you were researching about? And if so, what was your impressions of those areas?
Well, I did. It's been years ago. I wish I would have kept a journal, because I have forgotten some of what I saw. I did take some pictures and whatever. But I visited Lander, and I visited Graybull. I visited the Palisade Creek, took pictures, and I thought, well, at one time it probably was a wide open country. I could see where they could do their nefarious operations in that area. I went with my daughters, and they weren't as interested in history as I was. Otherwise, I probably would have spent more time there. I also went to Circleville and South Pass City. I don't know if I said that. But I enjoyed the trip immensely, and I've had a feeling, for us. I was looking for Elijah's dugout, but I couldn't find it. No. Somebody probably knew where it was. Palisade Creek.
Yeah, Palisades, Swan Valley region, just gorgeous, just absolutely beautiful. But like most of those regions, tough winters. It would have been hard to live in a dugout in an area that had snow for so much of the year.
Yeah, I don't know how he managed, but he made friends with some upstanding citizens, at that time, the Daniels family. And they kind of, had him for meals, and they looked in on him and whatever. And eventually he did tell them what he had done in the past. But they still, befriended him, along with his mice in his dugout, and making biscuits for him. And I thought that was, you probably read that part in the book. He had his good points, I suppose, but he just had a bad start in life.
I found that part particularly interesting on multiple levels. Woodland friends, a polite way to describe his mice pets, was both sweet. That perspective of him is in such contrast to how he's described when he's kind of a younger, rougher character back in his horse stealing days.
Yeah, you see a more gentle side to him there, and I imagine he was very lonely.
Yeah,
because his son had died, his wife had moved on, and remarried to a Doxford. Well, I don't know if he ever really saw him, for sure. I don't know. Because, had given up on her husband, Elijah.
This is a really interesting book in that you have Calamity Jane, who is this well-known figure, and thus, has a lot of myths and truths and half-truths about her. And then you also have the family side, which is much less well known, but, has a lot of gaps in that story. As you say, there's a lot of things that we don't know, and that's just the nature of what we do sometimes. So how, as you were, trying to sort through all these facts and fiction about Calamity and about her family, could you talk a little bit about that process and the difficulties that you found, but also maybe the things that you enjoyed the most out of it and how you sorted through all that to get to the heart of Calamity Jane and her siblings?
Well, I did it very carefully because some of the early stuff written about her, is full of myth. And she also did an autobiography. She had someone write it for her. But she had a lot of embellishments, a lot of mistruths, And so you really couldn't go by that either. I think I really went by the newspapers, what they said about her, where she was at a certain time. Sometimes the newspapers were kind of understanding, and other times they were pretty critical of her. And then when you write, you have to say, well, this is what this source says. And there was also two gentlemen that wrote books that I referred to, I did my own research though, but I went back to their books and checked to see if I was on the right track. And one was, his name was Etuline, and the other was, I can't remember. Anyway, I went and kind of double-checked so that I was kind of on the right track. I didn't take any old books and say, okay, this is what happened, because, well, even Lena Calamity didn't agree on things, you know, and they had different stories what happened to the parents. Lena said that her parents were killed by Indians. Well, that's not what you know, Calamity says. So it's really hard to get through to the truth. So you just have to do the best you can and compare sources and use primary sources, of course, when you can. And so the newspapers, you know, where somewhat would give you maybe the whole story, but and there's still mysteries. There's still mysteries out there about her. You know exactly what happened. Did the best I could.
Right.
These newspapers, sometimes they're great, and sometimes the newspapers are just like encouraging the mythology. And so that was one thing I really appreciated about your book, Jan, is it did a very good job of talking about sources, even debunking Jane's claim. In your first chapter of the book, you talk about how Jane's autobiography was perhaps not as representative of reality as someone might hope it would be.
Yeah, it would be nice if she told the real story, but she didn't, so that doesn't help at all. Sometimes she'll get where she was, maybe sometimes, but what she did there, she was what they'd call a camp follower. You know, she would join the expeditions, whether it was mining or whatever it was, or when they're opening a new town or the end of the railroad line or whatever. She would go and she would be a follower, a camp follower. She wasn't the scout or the leader or, you know, she wasn't the main person in the story. But she just loved adventure, apparently. And so she just went wherever the adventure was. She was all over the West. And, of course, she had a shady side to her, too. And so she was a cook and a laundress. And she sold her autobiography and her pictures, because she had a lot of pictures taken of her, and she sold them to fund her daughter. She had a daughter named Jessie, to fund her education, her schooling and whatever. So she had many facets to her, many facets. She did take care of her daughter. For the most part, she farmed her out, you know, quite a bit, and then later they became estranged. But she tried, maybe.
You know, there's just this clear and sad just presence of alcohol in Calamity's life. You can tell that that was a habit that did a lot of damage to her life. But at the same time, there's all of these moments with Calamity helping the sick and the poor and lending people money. And you see a side of her in which there really is some golden qualities that are kind of combating these perhaps not so wholesome qualities that she's also picked up over the years.
Right. And she died of inflammation of bowels, and that probably is attributed to her alcoholism. And she spent a lot of time in jails in different towns because she would, you know, become intoxicated, and she would be, well, annoying and getting into trouble and whatever. So they put her in jail, and that's probably the best place for her. And so she spent time in jails, and because of her intoxication, and that was her downfall, was drinking too much.
Yeah. And
I don't know how she got on that, but in the West, I guess it wasn't hard.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Well, if you don't mind, one myth of Calamity's life that is kind of maintained to modern day is her relationship with Wild Bill Hickok. Do you want to speak to listeners a little bit about the most famous gunslinger in America and how he connected to Calamity in South Dakota?
Well, when they came on the trail together in 1876, she was in jail somewhere, and they wanted, Wild Bill stopped at this, I think it was Laramie, I can't remember now, I was going to look it up, but I forgot, and took her out of jail because the town wanted to get rid of her. And so she went with him. In other books, it says, she was riding with Wild Bill into Deadwood, you know, in her buckskins on this horse and, whatever. Well, actually, she was in terrible shape. And Wild Bill didn't care for her at all, even though I don't know where the myth came about, but he didn't care for her. And he was married. He had just married a circus star, Agnes Lake, a little bit before that. And he wanted to go to, the gold was discovered in the hills in 1874, and he wanted to go to Deadwood. Well, what he did in Deadwood mostly was gamble. He wasn't out there looking for gold. And Calamity was supposedly, she thought she was in love with him. I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, he had no time for her. And and then he was, of course, killed in Deadwood. He was shot by Jack McCall, and they shot him in the back of the head. He was buried in 2 different places. They moved his body. The final resting place was Mount Moriah. And when Calamity died, supposedly she requested to be buried next to Wild Bill because she was supposedly in love with him or whatever. That, again, is we don't know. We think the townspeople possibly did it as a joke because, Bill, just didn't have any time for Calamity. He was married to a circus star, and why would he be messing around with Calamity Jane? So I think that myth should be debunked, even though they are buried side by side. It doesn't really mean anything. Except you can see 2 famous legends together there, side by side.
Often discussed about at the same time, even if there was perhaps a little less romance there than modern Hollywood would like us to believe.
Sam, if you are insulting the masterpiece that is the 1950 whatever classic Calamity Jane with Doris Day and Howard Keel, I do have to take umbrage with you, because though there is no fact in that film at all, Doris Day is wonderful and cute. So I won't have that slander, but I do agree that obviously this does perpetuate the myth.
No, nothing but respect for the 1950s classic.
Good.
Jan, with your own personal research and getting very close to these stories, how do you feel about media representations of Calamity, perhaps one of the most famous Western women and one of the women most depicted in Western movies?
Well, I saw the one with Doris Day, but that's years ago. And I always thought, well, this is really crazy. But it is. And believe any of it. But I think, if Hollywood gets hold of a legend, a legend must give them license to do these things. I don't know. Yeah. Because if you just took her as a raw frontier woman and what she really was like, she wouldn't be very famous in the movies. But somewhere she said in a newspaper clipping, I wish I would have pulled that out, that the life of a woman was hard. It wasn't fair. So I think she resented in a way, being a woman because she was restricted to what was expected of her in society. Mm-hmm. And she broke the mold. She did wear dresses once in a while, but she liked to wear her buckskins, and she was good with the whip. She could handle a gun. She could drive a team. I'm sure she could drive. I don't think that's a myth because she did help Warner deliver his supplies and whatever. So I think she could drive a team, of horses, take care of herself. I mean, she probably wouldn't be someone we'd want to emulate as a role model. But she was her own person.
Yeah.
Like it or not.
She walked to the beat of her own drum.
Yeah, she did. She did. And it wasn't something that was done in the West very much by women. Oh, there were a few women. I haven't researched them that maybe committed robberies and stuff with the men or something, but she was something else.
And I think this is, kind of leads into another, interesting question when we talk about Calamity Jane, and in this case, Lige, who, of course, ended up in prison for horse thieving and things like that, with the fact that some people, remember Calamity Jane and perhaps her siblings poorly, and some people remember them fondly. How do you navigate storytelling about people who have sort of such polarizing opinions about them, who are sort of hated by some and loved by others? Like, do you find that to be a difficult balance when you're writing something like this?
Well, I look back at that old book written by Corsi, the one that I saw when I was 12 or something. And in that book, he had documented talking to different people that knew Calamity and knew how they helped when somebody was sick, how she came to their aid, how she used her money. She must not have had a lot because, you know, she had to work hard for it, to buy a food, bring to them, and whatever. And there were quite a few stories in that book where she had helped people in Deadwood. And they had that smallpox epidemic in Deadwood, and she risked her own life, although some said she was exposed to it. I don't know for sure if that's true or not. So she did risk her life, I think, maybe taking care of them. And so she had a good element to her. Just got caught up with alcohol. I think that was the main driving factor. And then when she was inebriated, you know, she didn't know what she was doing half the time. She did take care of her little girl, maybe not real well because she farmed her out to different people when she probably wanted to go on a spree. And she did try to enroll her in schools in Deadwood and whatever. And so she had, you know, she had a good side to her. And I think the alcohol probably gave her maybe the courage to do all the wild things she did. She's a tough one to analyze. I don't know. But she's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and these people are just so complicated. Elijah, there is definitely moments of his story, and he really seems up to no good and doing things that are pretty foul and hard to think about, especially the violence towards the horses. It's also interesting, this perspective of him as a hermit with a heart of gold at the end of his life, when he's being viewed in Swan Valley just with a very different perspective.
Yeah, it is. They had good in them, but the West was wild, and where they lived, you know, there was a lot of temptation to, you know, do things that they shouldn't have been doing. And according to what I've read, the mother wasn't a very good mother that they did have, and the father was supposed to have been a minister, but I don't know if he was for sure. You know, you just don't know what to believe. So they probably didn't have a real good start in life, and they were farmed out when they were young, and I don't know what kind of homes, you know, they were in Salt Lake either. Lena must have had a good home. She's the only one that had some, you know, common sense and was just a wife and mother. That's, you know, and she died young, unfortunately, but she had 7 children, and so she was busy taking care of them. So, you know, it's strange how she turned out pretty good, and the other 2 were something else. And then there was supposed to have been other children, but where it happened to them, where they are, I don't know. It's just lost to history, I guess.
Well, you mentioned growing up on a farm. You mentioned currently owning a ranch. You, of course, have spent a lot of times in the Badlands of South Dakota and a lot of other areas in those western areas of the Dakotas. And, of course, you published a book, Memoirs of a Country Girl. You seem to be very familiar with western living. How has this impacted your research and writing?
Well, I think probably because I can relate to some of the challenges that these people went through. Because living, you know, out here, I'm not exactly young anymore. When I was growing up on the farm in Gregory County, we didn't even have running water yet.
Wow.
And, or central heat, or we had to, you know, cut our wood and whatever down at the river. And so I think I can relate a little more to what people had gone through, what they were facing each day living in the West. Because like right now, like I just alluded to, the fact that we have grasshoppers that are eating everything, no rain, you know, it's hot. Well, we're lucky we have air, you know, central air. Running water and all that, but when you think about what they had to endure, no wonder they were kind of wild and cranky at times.
Yeah.
So I think I can relate to them, because it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah, it's hard living.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and you have to be resourceful, and if you don't have the right guidelines to begin with, yeah, you can go astray. We still have people that rustle cattle once in a while. You hear about
Yeah.
there, in the West. That's our world, I guess. But I can relate to them. Yeah, I've always loved Western history because it takes a lot of courage, a lot of mettle and grit to get through it sometimes. So I feel sorry for, Calamity and Elijah because they had little issues, especially Calamity, I think. But, when she had her funeral, when she died, a lot of people came to her funeral. It was a huge funeral. So I don't know if it was because they were just curious or if they had some connection with her, or whatever. But so she would have been awed by that, I think.
Between breaking gender barriers at the time for going on adventures, for getting into trouble, as well as helping those who are needy. One thing can be said about Calamity Jane, and that is she left one big legacy when she exited the world. She really did make a big impact that is still being discussed about today.
Yeah, it's really hard to believe. I wonder what she would think. That she was more than a legend in what she did in the West, but, people are still writing books about her. I'm thinking about maybe doing another one. I don't know. What do we learn from Calamity? What do we learn from her? Why are we so enamored with her? I mean, it would make a good sociology maybe or something class. I don't know. She's got a lot to her. There's another book written, it's Old Deadwood Days. It's written by Bennett. Last name is Bennett. Esteline or something like Bennett. She writes about Calamity in a chapter in her book about knowing her and meeting her and whatever. And she said in there that Calamity liked kids. And she would have candy with her. And when the kids, in Deadwood would come up to her, they knew she had candy. Sometimes the mothers let kids approach her. Other times the mother said, no, you don't want to go up to that lady, she's dirty or whatever, But some kids would come up and get candy from Calamity. So that's another feature that's kind of strange.
Before we wrap up, is there any other last comments you have on Calamity's family or your research that you'd like to add before we let you go for the day?
I think one interesting thing about Calamity, she came back to the Black Hills right before she died in 1903, and she went to Cary, which is was a small town above Deadwood, and she went there for her last days, and she died, there, and of course that's why she got buried in Deadwood in Mount Moriah. I thought it was interesting how she came back, all the places she had traveled in the West. I mean, she was in practically every state in the West up to something, but she came back to Deadwood for her final days. And I thought that was something. Maybe it's because the people in Deadwood, maybe they treated her halfway decent because she was kind of I guess you call them oddballs, They evidently, she had some kind of feelings for Deadwood. So I thought maybe that was something interesting too, that she came back. And then Elijah was buried, in Roosevelt, Utah. And I went and visited that grave site, and it's just kind of a lonely place, and I think that he was buried, and I thought, oh gosh, he died without probably no one really noticing, that was sad. And then I don't know if he mentioned that his son died too at 19. Did we mention that? If not, well, I thought that was another sad thing.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, the Doxfords, his former wife and her husband died of influenza. So I thought that was a sad ending to them and then to Elijah's son. There's sadness in life, of course. So anyway, I loved writing the book. I probably did more research on that book than I have done on any other book, because I had to dig to find stuff.
Well, it shows. I felt the book was really well documented. I really appreciated the different use of newspapers and quotes from journals and such. I think you did an excellent job of talking about Calamity in a way that perhaps hasn't been talked about, and then the fascinating story of Lena and Elijah as well. And I'm going to plead ignorance here. I did not realize before reading your book how much time Calamity had spent in Idaho. I had never thought of Pocatello as one of her stopping points, but I found that really fascinating that Calamity had spent at least a little time over in our area too.
Yeah, it is interesting where she was just everywhere,
Yeah.
And wherever there was something going on, boy, she made a beeline to get there. Whether it was railroad, and that kind of helped too, because the railroad was stretching out to the west too. I spent a lot of time in Pierre, South Dakota. You probably haven't been in South Dakota. And that surprised me. I didn't know she was in Pierre that much, and she was on that Fort Pierre Deadwood Trail a lot too. So she was just left her mark everywhere, really. It was fantastic. I wish I could flash back and watch her.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, well, it's been wonderful talking to you, and I hope you got something out of it.
Absolutely. We're grateful for you to come in on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for getting on a call with us. We appreciate your willingness to add to, Western history and Idaho history, as we love to talk about. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jan. For those of you who are interested, Jan's book is in stores, it's online, but it's also sold here at the Old Idaho Penitentiary in our gift shop. Stop by, pick up a copy. It's absolutely fascinating, and it will give you a look into some fascinating Western history. Jan, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it, and we hope this can be a good chance to remind people that Calamity made a stop in Idaho.
You're welcome.
We have a tradition on the podcast. We have kind of an outro, a saying. If Skye was to say,
do your own time.
How would I finish it?
What would you add to it? You go in and you do your, what you've been sort of assigned to do. You go in, you do your own time. What would be like another instruction to include?
Oh, do your own time. Well, I always go beyond that.
Excellent. Do your own time and beyond that is excellent.
I've always gone beyond because I guess I'm always searching for something new, learning something about something. I do more than that.
Well, Calamity Jane definitely did her own time and went beyond that as well. So I think that's a fitting way to end this.
It was a good study.
Well, for those listeners out there, don't forget to do your own time.
Do your own number.
Bye.
If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe so others can find our podcast. If you're interested in more Old Idaho Penitentiary information and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in this episode, follow the Old Idaho Penitentiary on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to learn more about the Idaho State Historical Society and its other sites, follow ID State Historical Society on Instagram or visit history.idaho.gov. If you have a question or comment for the hosts, please email us at behindgraywalls@gmail.com.